Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah McFarland, and I'm excited to share with you the findings of my problem of practice dissertation titled From Control to Care, a multiple case study of Memphis charter school teachers' culturally responsive classroom management perspectives. I'd also like to thank my mentor, Dr. Ann Steckety, for her support throughout this process. Here's a brief overview of today's presentation. I'm going to start with the problem and literature, then move through my purpose, research questions, theoretical framework, methodology, findings, and implications. And I'll conclude with limitations and my plan for disseminating the findings. So let's jump in. I want to start with the problem. In Memphis and nationally, exclusionary discipline practices like suspensions and expulsions disproportionately affect Black students. These practices are linked to harmful academic and social outcomes. And despite reform efforts, these disparities persist here in Memphis. You can see that even as the suspension rate has gone down in Memphis Shelby County schools, Black students are still suspended at a higher rate than white students. You can also see that while MSCS represents 10% of the state's student population, it represents 25% of the state's suspensions. We know a lot about what is not working from the literature. There are decades of research that have shown that exclusionary discipline often causes harm. It reinforces racial inequities and it fails to improve student outcomes. We know teachers have a role to play. The evidence is pretty clear that teachers often make biased disciplinary decisions that reinforce disparities. They refer Black students more often than white students, while Black students are no more likely to misbehave than white students. And we know that teachers don't see themselves as playing a role in perpetuating racial disparities in discipline, and that their classroom management, that is, the actions that they take to create an effective learning environment, can either perpetuate or prevent the harm caused by exclusionary discipline. There's less research on what is working. In particular, we could benefit from a deeper understanding of what teachers who are effective at managing classrooms in culturally responsive ways are doing and thinking. The field is starting to explore alternatives, things like restorative practices, empathy interventions, teacher reflection, and skill building, but they're often studied at the program or the policy level. And what we need is a closer look at the teachers in the classroom who are already doing this well, especially those in the charter school context where the literature is mixed on whether they are helping or harming. So this is my study's purpose. With all of that in mind, I hoped to explore how Memphis charter school teachers who employed a positive approach to classroom management perceived and utilized the tenets of CRCM, culturally responsive classroom management, in their management approach and application of exclusionary discipline policies. To achieve this purpose, I had three questions. How do these teachers describe their actions that align with the reflective tenets? How do they describe their actions that align with the active tenets? And how do they describe their perspectives that align with the tenets of CRCM in their application of exclusionary discipline policy? As referenced in my questions, culturally responsive classroom management, or CRCM, was the theoretical framework that undergirded my study. CRCM, as defined by Weinstein and colleagues, is more than a set of strategies. It's really a frame of mind. It consists of 5 tenets, which are divided into the categories of reflective and active for the purpose of this study. The 3 reflective tenets involve self-awareness and critical reflection, recognition of personal bias and ethnocentrism, a knowledge of students' cultural backgrounds, and an awareness of the broader social, political, and economic context. The 2 active tenets involve an application of the critical reflection from the reflective tenets. The first is the use of culturally appropriate management strategies, and the second, really the foundation of CRCM, is a commitment to building caring classroom communities through high expectations and strong relationships. Let's get into my methodology. I employed a constructivist worldview in this study because I aimed to understand and interpret teachers' experiences within a specific context. Because of this desire and worldview, I chose a qualitative paradigm, specifically a multiple case study. I chose this design because I wanted to understand within the specific bounded cases teachers' experiences using qualitative data sources. I wanted to strengthen the potential for transferability of my findings, which is why I chose a multiple instead of single case study. I used convenience and criterion sampling to identify the charter schools that participated in my study. Each charter school, given a pseudonym, was a case in my study, and each case met the criteria of being a charter school in Memphis, Tennessee. School leaders or other school-based staff recommended teachers as potential participants based on their positive approach to management. My study ended up having 4 participants, each who met that criteria of employing a positive approach to classroom management. They had teaching experience ranging from 1 to 30 years, and they taught in grades ranging from kindergarten to 5th grade. 3 were white women, and 1 was a Black woman. And 2 of the cases had 1 participant. 1 of the cases had 2 participants. Data was collected through interviews, observations, and post-observation debriefs. The interviews were semi-structured and guided by the tenets of CRCM. The observation was non-participant, and the CREOP rubric was used to ensure alignment with CRCM. After each observation, I held a brief post-observation debrief to understand from a teacher themselves why they made certain management decisions. After I collected the data and organized it, I engaged in 3 rounds of coding. After that, I merged the cases and I uncovered 6 themes to answer the 3 research questions. So let's jump into my findings, the fun stuff. In response to the first research question, the reflective tenets, I found that teachers critically compared their identities and their own school experiences as to their students as they made management decisions. They also learned about their students' cultural backgrounds, especially their linguistic backgrounds, and leveraged that knowledge in their support of their students. Lastly, maybe the most interesting finding to me, I found that teachers expressed awareness of differences between their classroom context and the school context, but they didn't expand beyond that to the broader social, political, or economic contexts. For the second question, the active tenants, I found that teachers used a host of proactive, culturally responsive strategies like nonverbal signals, student images, morning greetings, and they also used a host of responsive strategies, all de-emphasizing punishment, things like restorative conversations, shared accountability, strong relationships. And then, in what was probably the clearest theme in my study, I found that these teachers repeatedly set high expectations for and built strong relationships with their students. They really saw these 2 things, high expectations and relationships, as interrelated and reinforcing each other. And in response to my third research question, focused on exclusionary discipline policy, I found that teachers really had mixed feelings about exclusionary practices. Sometimes they felt a tension between their own values and the need for student safety. And most of them saw it as the end of a series of actions where they tried to exhaust all other options before referring a student. They did feel pretty unprepared to manage unsafe student behaviors in a different way and had inconsistently experienced administrative support. By and large, my findings align with and extend current literature. Teachers in this study demonstrated the mindset and practices described in CRCM scholarship, especially Ladson Billings' warm demander. I do see an opportunity to consider how contextual awareness might actually be a continuum and how we could perhaps build on teachers' school classroom level awareness to expand to the broader context. I also found that charter school teachers in my study were clearly committed to strong relationships and care, and that really does contradict the literature on charter schools as harmful and no nonsense and perpetuating disparities. In contrast to the criticism that CRCM is hard to implement, my participants leverage their reflections and learnings about students in very specific and tangible ways. I have a few recommendations for key stakeholders based on my findings. For charter school administrators, I found that teachers in these contexts experienced inconsistent support from administration, and they also weren't aware of the broader implications of their classroom management decisions. So I recommend charter school administrators support teachers by making the goal of equity and discipline explicit. For charter school teachers, my findings imply that critical self-reflection and a focus on learning about students' cultural backgrounds is meaningful. I also recommend that teachers develop a consistent practice of considering how their actions are either perpetuating or eliminating disparities in the use of exclusionary discipline. For teacher preparation programs, I found that teachers feel unprepared to respond to unsafe student behavior in culturally responsive ways. And so I recommend that these programs work to prepare teachers to respond to serious behavior with equity in mind. And finally, for researchers, I was unable to include student perspectives in my study. I highly recommend future researchers include student perspectives on their teachers' management approach, as I think it's critical to further understanding this context. Of course, my study had limitations. It was a small, context-specific sample of charter school teachers in one city. My hope is that the insights I found offer depth that can inform the broader discussions taking place about this. I plan to share my findings at conferences like AERA and NAME and to submit to journals focused on equity, teacher education, and school discipline, as well as to share my findings with local organizations that work with charter school teachers and leaders. This work was grounded in a rich body of scholarship. There's a lot of research on this topic, which I've listed here and on the next slide. I hope that this study contributes meaningfully to this conversation about how we can move from control to care in our classrooms, especially for our most vulnerable students. Thank you so much for your time and attention.